So good evening, ladies and gentlemen, across cities, countries, and continents, close and afar. Thank you again for being with us on a busy weekend, especially on Boxing Day when all of us in a festive spirit, celebrating life in the joyousness she deserves. And what can be better than celebrating an evening with a very special edition of Candid Conversation, when we shall jointly unravel the little secrets of a very charming lady who has lived her life in the complete freedom of her energetic existence, not caught up with the rules of conformism, not meshed with the demands of a rigorous corporate life, not stressed by the constant attention she gets involuntary in her public life, not bothered about the fireworks she triggers around her perpetually by her charismatic presence. Oh yes, she's spectacular and unique in many ways. She's Ononno, she's diverse, she's Ononno Mukherjee. And yes, the quintessential alchemist lives in her soul. Ononno Mukherjee, a former business journalist, is an acclaimed writer with many publications to her credit. Before moving to Singapore, as the editor of HRM Asia, she has amassed years of experience in the India print and television media. Her journalistic acumen covers a whole gamut of subjects, including politics, lifestyle, and businesses. Ad Satya, The Half-Truth and Other Stories, Ananya's first book, a collection of 20 short stories, was published in 2016. Her second book, An Unborn Desire, a collection of 15 short stories, published by Rupa Publications, was launched in September 21. Ad Satya, an adaptation from the title story of her first book, has been staged in Dastak, a Hindi theatre festival in Singapore, and subsequently at the prestigious Kalagora Festival in Mumbai, India. Ananya, as most of you know, is also a theatre actor, a scriptwriter, and an active member of Open Stage, a group theatre based in Singapore. Over the last decade and a half, she has been a flag bearer of Tagore's Society Singapore. She has performed lead roles in several productions, including The Verdict, An Enemy of the People, The Post Office, Punti Ramayan, and Maharoti, amongst others. Her fun role as a 60-year-old in a short film, Ilish, won her lots of appreciation. Ononno has scripted and directed many creative shows. Noteworthy, her shows on Tagore, titled Bhuvon Jora Ashon Khani, the first ever online global Rabindra Jayanti, breaking conventional barriers and bringing together artists from different parts of the world. As an ambassador to Tagore's philosophy, Ononno's cultural production reflect the universal truth of harmony and peace. Her shows, Namoho and Gane Ropare, immaculately bring out the essence of Tagore's spirituality. Thakur Barir Ondor Mohol is a unique peek into her inner quarters of the celebrated Tagore family of Jorashok. She has recently produced Janani Boshundara, an approach to protecting and preserving the planet, which is due to be released very soon. Ononno was also nominated for an International Tagore Award in 2020. She has recently scripted Ontohin, an audio play in Bengali, show anchor and storyteller under the stage name of Juju Buri. She is a known figure in the cultural and literary circles in Singapore and India. Ononno is also a trained dancer and has been performing on stage since her early childhood. She has played lead roles at Tagore's dance dramas, including Shama, Chitrangada, Tashid Desh. She has also performed under the tutelage of Pandit Biju Maharaj. In addition to her explorations in English and Bengali, Ononno writes poetry in Hindi, and some of her poems were published in a literary magazine, Nazanya, in India. She is a corporate communications leader and wears a senior corporate leadership hat, and currently leads communications in Asia and Europe for a US-based multinational company, Cargill Protein. And so, when she's not chasing timelines and trying to crack a strategy, she writes stories and theater scripts and spends time in performance, arts, and pleasure travel. She lives with a doctor husband in Singapore. They have a lovely daughter studying in UK. I will now get Ananya on screen. There, I have you, Ananya, finally. But I need to make sure that I'm on screen too. So I'm going to add myself to this, right? So we can see each other. Welcome again, Ananya. Welcome to Candid Conversation. Thank you for taking time out from a busy schedule for being with us this evening. We have only an hour to unravel many secrets and facets of your extraordinary life, wherein you have listened intently to all your callings within. From a very early age, you have lived in the complete freedom of all these options which have arisen within you. So let us start from the very beginning. Do tell us a bit of your early years.
Thank you. I'll start. First of all, I think I need to thank everybody who's in here. It's Boxing Day, day after Christmas, and I'm sure everybody's busy. So thanks for taking your time out to listen to an author. We are the most unheard and unlistened to people in the world, I guess. So that's why we write. But thank you for taking your time out and for being here. Thanks to Shayan for hosting me. I'll start right from the beginning. And he said something about being unconventional. I don't know how unconventional I am, but my dad tells me that when he walked into the army hospital where I was born on a very rainy morning in August 1975, the first thing he saw was a baby girl sucking onto her big toe instead of the thumb. And he was kind of taken aback because that's not something that he was expecting. I was born maybe for just over an hour, and he was completely taken aback by this sight, and he decided to name me Ananya, or Ananya, which means unique. So as a child, I was told it means extraordinary, and it was only until recently that I discovered that Ananya means nothing but different from the others. And so I lived with the pressure of wanting to be extraordinary all my life, only to discover at a very later stage of my life that, oh, this was unnecessary pressure. I could have just been myself and I would still be different and unique. So let me start from that note. So I was born in Jammu, which is, I think, it's a unique feature in itself for a Bengali girl to be born in Jammu and having Rajma Chawal as a soul food. So I was born in Jammu. My parents were in Kashmir at that point in time. I lived with my sister. She went to school. I had none because there were no schools. And so I grew up in the beautiful valley of
Kashmir
Kashmir,
Valley. How lovely is
Kashmir
that?
Valley. My parents were very young. And till date, I have to answer a lot of immigration officers. Why was I born in Jammu or Kashmir? Because my Indian passport or my overseas passport now, the OCI actually says born in Kashmir. And there was a time when I actually told the immigration officer, because my parents were young, maybe, why was I born in Kashmir? The other time I said, galti ho gayi saab, agli baar kahin aur paida ho jaungi. But nonetheless, so I was born in Kashmir. And I spent a couple of my first years in Kashmir, which I think had a huge impact on me, so much so that, yes, the vastness, the expanse of nature around me, that was the first thing that I grew up with. Watching my dad come back home in an orange Land Rover, where I would watch him come through we could see him across, and there were hills, and I would just wait for his Land Rover to make one more turn, and then I could see him coming through. So I think that's something that was fantastic. We were a very small family, with limited resources, not because we didn't have the resources, because it was so far off. So we started enjoying little things. So fish for a Bengali family was a rarity because it would just come to us once a month from Pathankot. And if you're Bengali, you would know what that means. You could just get that once a month. And so we started appreciating little things. And the one thing that I think made the biggest impact was Kashmir back then was extremely secular. And my dad started the Durga Pujo. We had Saraswati Pujo at home, where all our non-Hindu, Bengali friends would come in and we would go to their place on Eid. So that whole thing about us being best friends with Rukhsana Didi, as well as having the Khan uncles come over to our place for Saraswati Pujo or Durga Pujo was so important. And I think that was the foundation. That's where I grew up. I mean, few things, nature. Yes, I loved, I started loving nature. The love for the mountains, the love for that vastness. I'm claustrophobic, by the way, because I think I was born in such an expansive,
one of those little secrets we're getting to know from now. Okay.
Beautiful stretch that it kind of makes me not a city girl. So that's where I was born. And then my parents moved across different states. My dad was in a company that allowed him to be in different parts of India. So I traveled with him wherever he went. My sister was studying in a boarding school in Kolkata, and she was the elite elder sister who would come from straight out of an Enid Blyton boarding school and tell me stories about, how life is. And I, on the other hand, was struggling to even start my primary school education because most of these places would not even have a school. So until I was 8, I couldn't speak English to save my life. I didn't even have a formal, proper education until the time I was 7, and I got into a school which entertained me. And I think that's again another lesson where I learned that I had to fight my way up. And I learned that in order to be seen, you needed to excel. You needed to excel in whatever you did, whether it was dance or your academics. So from the time that I joined my first school, where I got a 4 out of 25 in math, much to my parents' disappointment, I finally came out of the school never having, I left that school when I was in grade 2, but I had never stood anything but first in that school. And that's how I got my recognition, because I saw that if I have to make my presence felt in a class where I was not even a registered student and my name was not on the roll call, imagine the kind of trauma a child who's 7 going to school for the first time in life has, and she's not recognized in class. She's a non-identity. So I think that's the first lesson. Again, a very important lesson that you need to find your place wherever you go, and you need to excel in whatever you do. If you're focusing on yourself and you're generating that energy around you, everybody is bound to acknowledge what you're doing.
That self-drive which you're talking about. So that's
absolutely,
so brilliant.
Absolutely. And that I was pushed into it, but I think I picked that art quite early. And then, of course, my parents moved. I moved with them. Then finally, we were in Durgapur, which was one of the saner cities in India, small town, but closer to Kolkata. And I had the opportunity to study in a school for a longer stretch. Then I came to Lady Brabon, Kolkata in my 11th standard, did my high schooling, did my graduation, and then went to Nagpur to complete my master's in mass communication. And yes, I graduated from the 11th institution.
So that's what I was getting at. So you've traveled across cities. You've been to Bhopal, Patiala, Jamshedpur, Hyderabad, Vizag, I think all those
everywhere.
places.
So all the steel cities with my dad. And I married my husband when I was in university. First, I had just completed my first year in university, and he was in the army. So I traveled with him as well. So between us, I did 15 states and he did 19. So we are, we're pretty much well traveled in India and lived there until we moved to Singapore, of course, 18 years.
So basically, from your very early on, you have been a traveler, like a seeking nomad, exposing yourself to diverse backgrounds and cultures. And so that's how that whole continuity has remained even now. I mean, though you're static in one location now, but we'll come to that, in the chronology of events. But sitting there in Singapore now, you're still traveling all across because your mind and soul, you're a traveler and you're seeking. So that's a brilliant way of, getting the timescape in which you have started your early years. So do tell us a bit about, what happened. I mean, so you did your graduation and post-graduation from India itself, right?
Yes, I did.
Okay. And that was in mass communication?
I did my graduation in philosophy And then I did my post-graduation in mass communication because that's what I wanted to do. So I decided pretty early in life, when I was in grade 6, that I wanted to be a journalist. So at that point in time, I didn't even know whether the word journalist started with a G or a J. So I had to really, think, okay, journalist, what does that, how does that work? And but I knew I wanted to write, and I was pushed to a point where my sister, who's listening in, refused to help me with the homework, and she pushed me to a point. She said, no, I'm not going to help you, you need to do this yourself. And I did it. And when I did, I got an excellent in that homework, the first one that I ever wrote, an essay that I ever wrote. I was happy. First, it was an independent piece of work. And secondly, because it was appreciated and I liked doing it. So I realized I am good at something that I like to do. And I think that's very important. That's where most of us, we get, I think we divert our attention, because some people tell us we are good in this and we think, oh, wow, great, let me do that. But if your passion and your profession merge, then you excel because you want to excel, and it's no longer work. So I realized that pretty early, that English writing was my strength, or creative writing was my strength. And when I was getting appreciated for it, I decided to make a career out of it. But back then in India, journalism was agreeing to signing a contract to say, I'm going to live on a shoestring budget for the rest of my life and live.
Yeah. So you got into television journalism at that stage, right?
I studied television journalism, and my dad was not happy. He was questioning me. What would that mean? He just told me, I think we used to have Lakme lipsticks back then in India. He said that would only cater to your lipstick, if you realize, because you either have to marry a rich guy or you just have to think about something else, because this doesn't work. What's the glory in looking at a camera and speaking? So it was not as glamorous as it is today, or not even as high paying. So it was difficult. It was a choice that I made. And I said, no, this is it. And that's all. So I did my master's in television journalism, and I entered the workforce. I started working as a TV journalist in Nagpur first, and then in Bhopal. By then I had already married. So, which was also a very different thing. You wouldn't see a TV journalist at 21 being married.
That's right.
And I was, and I didn't see it as any kind of a deterrent to my career. So I did that for a while, and then our daughter was born. So I decided that newsroom wasn't the place that I wanted to be in, because television had just moved from being that 9 p.m. news to being around the clock, and I wanted to be there for my child. So I quit television.
And then you became the editor of the International Trade.
So we also moved from India to Singapore, and that's when I picked up business journalism.
So this was you were quite young then, just 31 years old, right?
I was even younger when I joined. I think we moved here in 2003, and I was 28 when we came here and I joined. At 31, yes, I became the first Indian woman editor.
Right, so breaking glass ceilings then itself.
Quite
first female also to be the first Asian, I suppose, to grab that role. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So wow. So the transition from there. So you were nearly 10 years in your super successful career as a business editor, and then you took that giant leap of faith, blindfolded in the corporate world. And just before, I think that was your 36th birthday.
Yes, that's right.
That's late by many standards. People getting into corporate life at the age of 36, the advantage is you're not conditioned by the corporate ways, but even then you had this, there's a gap in between the kind of work you were doing and what you're getting into. So tell us a bit about that transition, because that propelled you and that's taken you to where you are.
Absolutely. So when I came to Singapore, I started working, as you said, rightly said, working for HRM Asia. I was the news editor, then I became the editor. And during that time, I was talking to about 400 CEOs every year across the world, and learning so much about corporate communication, HR, people, and people management, talent management, and the whole gamut of it. So it wasn't just about HR. And then I took a break in between when I was writing Adi Satya, and I was freelancing around that time. So I was writing for eFinancial Careers. I was writing for the Singapore Business Review, the Hong Kong Business Review, and my world expanded beyond just people and HR. And so, I mean, that beat of journalism. And that is when I thought, my God, I've got this whole loaned knowledge and insight sitting in, with me, best practices of nearly all the big chips or blue chips around the world. And all I'm doing is writing the 18th article on work-life balance on the cover page and feeling thrilled about it. I might as well use this, apply this knowledge and insight and change lives. So that's when the Olam opportunity came through, and they wanted somebody. They had no idea. And corporate communications, actually, if you look at the trajectory of growth for the function by itself, you will see Asia is playing catch up. I mean, 10 years back, Asia was playing catch up. We thought corporate communications is somebody who does, HR, but has a nice knack of writing. Maybe can pull up a newsletter or something. That's what we thought corporate communications was all about. So it was pretty, I would say, very, very young. The function was very young. The understanding, the acceptance of the function was also young. People just thought we are event managers who everything under the wrap of employee engagement would go into, all the party girls would be corporate communications and internal communications. So I think that way it provided me a big opportunity because nobody had a clue. I didn't have a clue what I needed to do. They didn't have a clue what I could do. But when I joined, and it, like you rightly said, I was 36, so I could no longer be a management trainee. And at the same time, I was sitting with the C-suite, and I had to, really step up because I was here managing internal communications.
70 countries and 7,000
70
employees.
countries and 70,000 employees. And, I was just said, okay, you are the head of internal communications, do whatever you want. So it was it was a blue sky and a clean slate to start with. And I think I just took that challenge. I used all the learned wisdom that I had from.
You're being humble about it. You're being humble about it because I even got to read that you did get an award there too. Yeah. And so that was as a excellence in communication from the CEO.
Yes, so it was an excellence in execution, basically. So it wasn't just communication.
That's right.
It was an excellence award from the CEO.
Okay.
Within the first year of my landing up in Olam, so which was very humbling, I think. And so people started noticing, and I would very happily tell others, if you don't know who Ananya Mukherjee is and you're in Olam, I'm not doing my job because I'm the head of internal communications. And if you don't know who I am, then something's wrong with me. I need to change the way I work.
That's right.
And so that's what happened with Olam. And then I, of course, moved to, as I was growing in my career, I wanted to do more.
Spent 7 years in Olam, about 7 years?
7 years in Olam. I completely, built it from scratch. We've got another award later. So as a corporate communications team, we bagged another award. And then, of course, I thought I just didn't want to restrict myself to to internal communications because I came with the media backdrop. I had the knowledge of the business landscape, and I wanted to do more. And that's when Cargill offered me this role to lead their business, support the business in Asia and Europe and the protein business. So that's what I do now.
So that's a remarkable story because people normally in this kind of function, they rise from within the organization and it takes a number of years. So you just jumped into a setup which is huge and leading a corporate communication for Asia and Europe. And that too with just about, not very many years, 10 years you've been in this industry. Compared to the fact that people have been there for a longer period of time. So the role of corporate communication and the support to business strategy was you have to deliver high quality products. So how did you go about all of this early years and how you enjoyed yourself there? And because in spite of the fact that you're in a high pressure job, completely caught up with the schedule of the time scheduling and the activity happening across different time zones, you're still telling yourself that I have time to do all these diverse things we're going to come to now, right? So that's the brilliance of this conversation, because as an employee, as an executive person, you are involved with your daily life, yet you're finding time to do everything else. So tell us this little secret as to how this is happening, and whether it's spontaneous, or are you going to do you put little buckets to yourself that I'm going to wear my hat as into writing, into my theater, into my drama, into my poetry. So how does it all happen?
Okay. So like you rightly said, yes, I almost put in about 14 to 15 hours of work every day because of the time zones that in which I operate. So Asia and Europe, and then I report to the headquarters in Minneapolis, which is in the US. So I need to stay up most of the time, and I manage crisis. So I look after crisis management as well. So yes, it is a demanding job. It's a high profile job. It normally it would take everything out of a person. I think I am gifted in some ways. I tell myself that I have to spend time like I spend my budget. I'm not going to overspend myself. So there are days when I can't write because I want to write and I can't write because I'm probably writing a press statement to save the reputation of the organization for which I'm working. But there are other days and other times when I let myself do what I need to do because I'm like, okay, today's the day I need to sit and write this. And I would block time for myself and do that at a very practical, pragmatic way. Like, okay, this is your time. You can think through and fine. I mean, you have your you need to balance, you need to find a balance. And the question that you asked me just the other day as well during our conversation was, how do I do it all? I think it is, do you bucket? Do you make buckets? Do you compartmentalize your time? No, I think I just tell myself, this is what I'm doing right now. And my dad used to say this, ja korbe bhalo kore korbe, mon diye korbe, taholei bhalo hobe. I think I keep telling myself that whatever you are engaged in, give your 100% to it. If it's cooking, give your 100% to it. Don't just do it for the sake of doing it. Whether it's work, whether I mean, nobody's pushed me to work. No one's pushing me to cook. No one's pushing me to do the theater. If I'm doing it, let me do it well. You know, I think that's the thing that goes on in my mind. My dad saying, put your 100%, put your 150% in whatever you do. And it's important because I think going back to that lovely story by Leo Tolstoy, The Three Questions, which tells you the only time that matters is now. The only person who matters is who you're with right now. And the only thing that matters is what you're doing right now. And I think that is the mantra that I live with. Do it well, do it because you want to do it. Don't do it because it's there on your calendar. And that's worked for me. I probably am doing something right.
Oh, brilliant. Now, just coming to your book. So it's intriguing that when you started writing, did you have publication in mind? Or is it just that you were trying to express yourself from all the diverse experiences you've had in your work travel in different nations, in different countries? So there are a lot of things and events from which you got stories where you could relate to, or perhaps relate it through your eyes. So was that a kind of a trigger for you to start your writing?
I think it was a bit of both. So with the first book, it was more about putting in my thoughts together and, all the experiences that I had, the observations that I would have during my travels, meeting people, different cultures. With the second one, it was easier because I knew
both were short stories. Sorry for the viewers. Both are short stories. Okay.
Yes. The first one is Ardhi Satya, which is a collection of 20 short stories. And this one, Unborn Desire, is a collection of 15. With the first one, once the first one was out, to be honest, I did have publishers saying that they wanted to publish the next one. So I was thinking I'm writing a book because it's, that's how I wanted it. So it was a much more pragmatic approach to the second one than the first one. The first one was just venting out and, writing what I wanted to without really thinking about publishing it or not knowing if I'll get published. And it took me a couple of rejections, hundreds, I think, to get the first publisher. And once that was out, I think with people reading it and appreciating it, it became slightly easier to do the second one and to tell myself, okay, this is for the reader. This is not my diary. This is not my journal.
Yeah. So you did make other stories your own? Did you make other stories your own while you were writing these short stories?
Absolutely. Yes. So and I have been saying this quite a few number of times these days, that uh, when you write, you could connect because you have a great story. You can also connect because you're telling somebody else's story, and a lot of others identify with it. I think many authors, a lot of our contemporary authors, and end up writing that connect, and people love them because they connect, because they are kind of telling you your story. And I wanted to be like them, and I wanted to take that approach rather than telling myself what a fantastic life I have had or what miseries I have been through, because I thought that connection was important. When you just talk about yourself, sometimes you lose that connection. But when you are trying to build a connection, and touch somebody's heart and soul, it always makes sense to tell them their stories in your own way, but keeping the sacredness of their thoughts and their emotions
Well said.
intact.
So well said. So tell me, Ananda, do you get attached to everything around you? Attached in the real sense of the term? Or do you just observe everything from a distance as you would as a silent spectator to witness life and its twists and turns, and then capture them in the willfulness or wildness of your imagination?
Again, I think there are no extremes, right? You are
Mhm.
somewhere. Our life is in those shades of grays, not the 50, but the ones between the black and the white.
Mhm.
And there are things that I'm very attached to. So I would be in the Himalayas, along with Yudhishthir if I weren't. But when I'm writing, when I'm actually taking a back seat and observing people, I like to do that. It's like, you like watching a theater unfold in front of you, and you have characters, you have sequences, you have the highs and the lows, and you just take a back seat and observe. And I love doing that. And I think that's how my writing gets inspired. It's not so much about me completely being obsessed with a particular person or a culture and then putting in all my love and hatred and pain and all my emotions invested in it. But at the same time, to be a character, you can't write on behalf of a character you don't if you don't become the character. And I said this to you the other day when we were talking about how theater kind of helps. And I think being a theater artist it's easier because once you're out of the wings and you're on stage, you're somebody else. I think when I'm writing, I do tell myself that this is not me. This is not about me. It's not about how I feel. This is about this so and so character. And if I am this character, how would I react? What would my response be? Would I be on or now when I respond? No, it's going to be different, right? So I think in that way, then you do invest a lot of emotions. There are stories in this book, the new one and the old one, where I have laughed and cried with the stories even as I was writing them. And then I did tell myself, if I'm able to finish this with, because my voice is choking, with my voice choking and my eyes all teary, I think it'll touch somebody somewhere because I'm that character. I'm completely in that character. And I think it's a even to anybody who's probably thinking about writing, it's important, especially if you're writing scripts, especially if you're writing, telling somebody else's stories. You have to be that somebody. You have to have that empathy. And empathy is investing, right? It is investing your emotions,
Mm.
being that somebody. Despite the shoe bites, you have to slip into
That's
somebody
right.
else's shoes.
That's so well said. So you're living in a world which is, it's a realistic world, right? Where your feet are firmly on Mother Earth. You're grounded by reality. Everything you do around you is based on rational and on something which is, you can't, it's not that uh, you would prefer not to have a break in continuity, but you want a continuity to the set of activities and you want a conclusion, because that's the firm reality of the corporate hat which you wear, and that gets ingrained over a period of time. So you want a firm end, a resolution to the process which is happening for the day, for the week, for the hour, or whatever, even for the continuing, for the thought process. But here, the other part is you're a dreamer. You let yourself go beyond this shackles which is tying you down to the reality of living, and yet you're dreaming. You're with the clouds. you're having this, what you said so beautifully is that the empathy takes over you, where you're trying to transcend yourself within the conditioned being which you are. So do you do that effortlessly again? Or is it that you have to tell yourself at times that, no, I'm playing a role as a corporate woman, but I am intrinsically might be something else. You're a composition of so many things which has built you up over the years from a very early age. So how does this happen?
No, I think both are true. So I am a corporate woman. I can't deny that. It's in extremes again. Very funny. My corporate MBTI profile tells me I'm an ENTJ, which is probably the extrovert, the real pragmatic leader. And at the other end, I am this author, the artist, and I am the creative person that I am. And I want my, I wouldn't say I am anti-establishment, but I need my liberation, right? I don't want to be straight-jacketed and said, okay, this is your limit, this is this. I need my white space. So I think it's a mix of both. And human beings, we are a mix of a lot of different kinds of sentiments and emotions and I think strains, elements. They all as much. So the earth, water, fire exists in all of us. So it is not about if you're fiery, you can't have the earth or the air in you. It is all beautifully blended, and that's how we have been created. I think some of my elements are probably stronger. My fire is stronger when I'm in my corporate seat. My air and water are probably stronger when I'm on my in my creative seat, and maybe I'm more earthy than I'm on my personal life, on my personal level. So it's probably a mix of all these different elements.
Oh, well said. And I'm going to ask you a tough question.
Go ahead.
Do you have any fears?
I do. I'm human. I do. I think like I said, I was claustrophobic. I have huge claustrophobia. My biggest fear is getting drowned in a coffin and I can't breathe. I'm dead anyway, but I would still not like to be in a coffin, dying, drowning in a coffin. So that's definitely a fear, a phobia. I think on an intellectual, psychological, emotional level, it's losing my family. I think that's common to every human being. You have invested all your love, affection, all your, everything around you to your family, and you don't want to lose them. So that's a fear. That's not an insecurity, but that's a fear. I mean, how do you even face knowing? The pragmatic side of me will tell me that one day you will lose everybody, and if you're lucky, you probably will not see everyone gone around you, but you might, and that can be a reality. I think that is a fear I live with every day. I don't want to lose my family. I mean, that's true for all of us.
And do you have the fear of ever getting lost? Have you ever been lost? Have you?
Yes,
Metaphorically and physically.
Yeah. A couple of times. I have this remarkable reputation of landing up in the wrong hotel with the right address. And I have done this several times in several places. And it's a joke now in my professional life that people tell me, Ananya, this is the address. Just be there, in the right place. So I would end up in a wrong hotel with the same name, maybe. Not my fault. There has been a time when I actually, and I think I discussed this some other time with somebody. I had landed, I'll tell you this story because I'm a storyteller. I want to tell you this. Really, I don't know how I did it, or how it happened. So I have done this couple of times. I've booked Hyatt, Grand Hyatt, landed up in Hyatt Regency for a conference. I've booked a taxi to Taj Coromandel and landed up in another Taj, and drove everyone nuts saying, oh, I'm here in the lobby, come pick me up. And there was like nobody because I'm obviously in the wrong hotel. But there was this instance when I landed in Nairobi, Kenya, and I was very excited because after the conference, I was supposed to take a trip to a Kenyan safari, and this is going really good. I land in Nairobi, all my luggage comes with me, which is also a remarkable thing to happen in Africa, especially in some of these African airlines. And I landed, and there he is, Eddie Murphy look-alike, comes to pick me up, a hunk in a black suit, in a black Mercedes S-Class with, comes to pick me up. I'm thrilled to bits. Now I'm going to the right hotel. My chauffeur knows where he's taking me. I don't have to bother. And I make a call home, tell my husband, we had Skype back in those days, tell them, look at this lovely car. I have arrived in Nairobi, whatever. And now I'm, driving into the city and land up in a hotel, nice one. They offer me some juice, welcome drink, and then very politely tell me that this is the wrong hotel, ma'am, you're not booked here. And for once, I was like, okay, now this is not my fault. I didn't drive in here. So then I check back with my organization and they tell me, oh, sorry, we made a change last minute and we forgot to inform the chauffeur. So I did end up in the wrong hotel. No fault of mine, but again, so again and again and again. So I do get lost in foreign countries, not knowing where I'm going many a times. I think metaphorically being lost, I do that every day. Again, as an author, as a poet, I have to let myself loose whichever landscape I'm treading on. So whether it's human emotions, whether it's geographies, cultures, I'm talking about a story in Morocco or talking about a memory in Cape Town, I have to let myself loose. And I have to tell myself, I don't carry any baggage. I'm not going to be myself. I'm going to be somebody. This is not me. This is not Ananya Mukherjee out in the streets of this adventure, the metaphorical streets of adventure. This is somebody else. And I think that's the secret to being able to churn out the work that I do, because I don't want to be myself. And I have to let myself be open and be lost, so that I can observe and absorb and come back and radiate. I think
Well
that's
said.
important.
How well said. That's brilliant. But do you have, since your life is full of empathy and you couldn't have been a better boss, I think your subordinates must be really happy at this time of the year, specifically, I suppose, overtly and quietly, because they couldn't get someone better who will understand them and be with them at various points. I'm sure you must have given them all on leave and you must be staying back and working for all you know. Is that a fact?
Absolutely right. I did dig my own grave and tell everybody, take a time off, take the next 2 weeks off. I'm here to hold the fort for you. And it's very rewarding. I mean, honestly, I don't mind working for the next 2 weeks, knowing that I have an engaged team who will come back recharged, grateful, and happy. And that's what I want them to be when they are working for the team and when they are working for themselves. So I did receive some amazing Christmas gifts from all those people I had asked to stay back home and not come to work. So I think it's very, very rewarding. And it's not like a subordinate writing a note to the boss. One of the notes said, "You are my light." And I completely thought, I've never written to my boss. I've never said to my boss that you're my light. It was very humbling. And I think empathy does matter. I mean, all of us are working. It's a part of our life, but that's not our life. And as a boss, I need to recognize, or as a leader, I hate the word boss, basically. As a leader, I need to recognize that people have lives and they need to be their best to put in their best.
Absolutely. How well said. Yeah, so it's important that they get a feel of you being an eternal optimist. Are you an eternal optimist?
Well, again, I'll go back to a training. The same training that told me I was an ENTJ also did tell me that I had 100% optimism and 90%, 98% optimism and 100% resilience. So I don't know what test they did, but the trainer was kind of shocked. She said, "I've never seen somebody. Why don't you do the job that I'm doing?" So I said, okay. Even I didn't know I was 100%, resilient and 99% optimist. That's being foolish, I think. And she said, "No, that's great. Just keep it. Whatever you're doing, do it right." So yes, I am an optimist and 100% optimist. So I don't think the world is coming to an end today, no matter what, whether it's your joys or your pains. There'll always be a tomorrow and it's only going to be better.
Yeah, so that's so well put, because the harsh realities of life and living at times distracts you and makes you ask questions which are deep rooted. But the eternal optimist always finds a solution to all of those questions. It comes instantaneously and spontaneously, and you do that how better than through your action, because you're always full of energy and optimism drives energy. So whatever you're doing, whether it's cooking, I see those posts with all those meals you're cooking. I don't know whether it's you have a bevy of half a dozen servants to help you around, but there must be some secret somewhere. But you do that, you do your office hours, you do your writing, you do your poetry, you do your drama, you do your theater. So you're doing everything together in that effervescent energy which it deserves, and with doing it at a level which is so appropriate. I mean, it's just not doing it for, for your creation. You're doing it, but you're doing it so that others can also appreciate the amount of seriousness with which you're doing it. So that's really remarkable. And I'm going to ask you something which is very deeply personal, right?
Okay.
Are you religious minded? Are you a believer?
I am a believer, but I don't think I'm religious. I'm more spiritual, probably. I do a lot of religious activities, so to speak, a lot of rituals and Bhogranna. To those of you who are Bengali, you would know Durga Puja is important and Kali Puja is important. So I fast a few times a year, and I do it for everybody. So the reason why I do it is, of course, I am a believer, but do I really believe in, all of that is going to please God, and then God's going to say, okay, you have all my blessings and whatever you ask for is going to be granted? No, I think I do it mostly because it's a traditional in the family, and my parents are too aged now. They are, I don't want my mom to fast and feel sick. So I would rather do it on her behalf, and I do it. And if no one else is, it doesn't harm me to just fast for a day and do a prayer on behalf of the family and seek blessings for everybody. And so I do that piece. But again, going back to the subject that I majored in, philosophy. And if I have to tell you my secret, my light is Tagore, Gurudev, Rabindranath Tagore. And if I were to go by his philosophy again, I would think the thing to be honest about is the acceptance, the surrender to something that is bigger, mightier, purer, more beautiful than all of us put together. That could be God, that could be defined as God, that could be anything, but it's basically surrendering to a self that's your better self, your best self.
Beyond the self. Absolutely.
And I think that's what I do. So that's what I believe in the Tattvam Asi, as we say, with Tumi Shei, Tomari Moddhe Shei. And Gurudev has said it very beautifully. Amar Moddhe Tomar Prakash Tai Eto Modhur. So it is Amar Moddhe Tomar Prakash that I pray to. And yes, I am a believer. I believe je ota korle, if you go by it, things will, it works. Somehow it just works. Life has been good to me, so I can vouch for myself that I must be doing something right. Touch wood.
Oh, well, so that's so well said. So you have this extraordinary thing about yourself that you're not doing it because of scriptures. You're not doing it if someone's telling you to do it. You're just doing it in your own free will because you feel that's the best which is for you, right? So that's a huge takeaway, because most of us get caught up in this whole business of doing things because you're told, if someone's telling you, or someone's looking at, or you're looking at something in reciprocation for the activity which you're doing. I'm praying and I want peace, and I'm sacrificing something and I want something else in gain. So, but you're doing it in your freedom of your existence and not with an end in view. So that's so brilliant. And that's a contradiction in some ways, because here you want an end result to your daily activities. Everything, if there's something of your activity which is not finished for the day, it drives you crazy. I'm sure that's how your nature is, because you're a perfectionist and trying to complete it in what it deserves in totality. So that's a huge balance to your living. This is brilliant, really, in more ways than one. Yeah.
And I think praying keeps us humbled somewhere, because you're seeing what you can be and yet what you can't be, right? So you seeing your best self and you saying, okay, I can be like this. This is the standard. This God is your standard. So if you've got God as your benchmark, you surely know you're not going to get there, and it's going to keep you grounded. And you do want to get there because you want to be the best version of yourself.
Oh, well said. Yeah.
In some ways, it makes you ambitious and yet keeps you humbled.
So what inspires you the most, Ananya?
Life, generally, people. So I get inspired by people of all kinds, even the weirdest ones, if I could say so, because there's something funny, interesting, worth noticing, worth writing about everybody. So I think that's one inspiration from the energy around me. I think I inspire myself a lot. So I look at myself and I keep telling this to a lot of my other friends that please draw inspiration from your own self. Look yourself in the eye every day in the mirror. Nobody else needs to tell you who you are. And pat yourself in the back and say, well done, because you know your journey. Whatever milestones you've crossed has been because you are you. And they have been made possible by no one else but you. So I very modestly would say I do that very often. I would stand in front and say,
Mm.
you've been through that before. You can do it. It's you alone, and nobody else was playing God there. So I think that's important.
Oh, well said. Yeah. And I'm going to ask the difficult question. So where do you see yourself 5 years from now?
With some silver hair, reading at a book literary club or something. No, I don't think I'll do that ever. Probably writing more, traveling more. COVID became a deterrent to my travels. In the last 18 years, I have traveled to 47 countries.
Okay, good.
I wanted to complete the 50 before my 45th birthday. That didn't happen. I'm hoping before my 50th birthday, I managed to see another few countries. So traveling would be definitely one. Traveling for the love of traveling, not
And
to
it's not just all work related, because you do take
no.
travels, right?
Yeah. So it's work plus. So what I do is every time I travel for work, not every time, maybe 9 times out of 10 that I travel for work, I would keep an extended weekend for myself and travel around the place, because the places that I've been to for work have been very remote places. I mean, I wouldn't go on a holiday to Ivory Coast or to Gabon or to the remotest villages in Tanzania or to villages in China. So I would take some time out and do that piece for myself. Then travel becomes fun, because you're not just traveling for work.
Mm.
You finish your work, you take your Friday evening off, and you travel until you're there, whenever you want to come back home. So I do that. Uh, I think that's going to be definitely one. I'll probably be working on my next book. Each book usually takes about 3 to 4 years. I think I'll be
Okay.
working on that.
Mm.
I will be working, I think, doing a bit more with children and the communities that I am associated with. So right now, I try my best to be there, but voluntarily physically being there in person also makes a lot of difference. I haven't been able to do much of that in the last 2 years because of the travel restrictions. I would like to do that more. Yeah, 10 years from now, I can tell you I'll hang my boots and
Yeah, so
just
that's the
focus
difficult
on
question I was about to
writing,
ask.
maybe.
But that's a long way. So we won't talk
Yeah.
about that decade now. It's far away. So we're going to now talk a bit about Unborn Desire, right?
Sure.
And it'll be so nice if you can just briefly, why don't you do something? Why don't you read from three little excerpts from different diverse chapters, which you think it's fond enough to give a flavor of the book, and talk a bit about those 3 chapters where you're going to read.
Sure, I can do that. So I'm going to start with the title story because it's my favorite.
Okay.
It's called The Unborn Desires. And I'm going to read a little excerpt from here. Do you know what they did to me? No, I don't. Of course you don't. How could you? You were sedated and lying there like a rag doll, unconscious, while they cut me up into little pieces with cold metal, severing me from you forever. I'm sorry. I didn't know you suffered as I did. Did it hurt? They convinced me you wouldn't feel a thing. You weren't human yet. Oh, my body, or whatever that piece of flesh and blood was, felt nothing. Just a pinch, a tiny pinch of the cold, sterilized weapon. But my soul? Your soul? What about your soul? Yes, my formless, my infinite, my liberated soul. It was there within that clot of flesh. It was living and breathing within your boundaries. One day, I'll find a body again and take form. Would you recognize me then, Mama?
Oh, lovely.
So this is from the first story,
Yeah.
and I won't reveal too much, but it's about, it was triggered by the thought that if souls move from one body to another, as many of our scriptures and
Mm.
all the belief in the world says that souls are immortal, right? Do they have memories of births that haven't happened? So will a soul remember even a life that was probably as short-lived as being a fetus, or that was terminated, or was an accident or something?
Mhm.
So that was the whole thought, and I thought maybe souls do have memories of life that others haven't seen. So they could be unborn, souls,
Mhm.
and they could carry memories. So that's what the first story is
Oh,
about.
lovely.
And it talks about past life regression and a
Yeah.
lot of
Yeah.
things. So that's the first one.
Yeah.
I'm going to read out from another one, which is one of my favorites. And some of these stories start with a little poem. They're all
That's right.
mine.
So
And
I wanted
so,
to ask you that. So those poems are really, I love them, some of them, especially Moving Shadows. Okay.
right. Oh, that's a favorite of
Yeah.
mine. And
Mhm.
I can read that one, actually, The Moving
Okay.
Shadows. So The Moving Shadows actually is about Benares. If you have been to Benares,
Yeah.
my husband is from Benares, so
Mhm.
sitting on that ghat, the Dashashamedh Ghat or the Harishchandra Ghat or the Manikarnika Ghat, where you always see funeral pyres being,
Yeah.
active throughout the day. It was a beautiful feeling. So I'll read that out for you then. A quiet river, slivers of shadow, twigs, marigolds, ashes, nomads, all of them, floating to salvation. A fishing net, a bamboo flute, a matchstick, and a boatman. A brittle silence, waiting for a stone.
How lovely is that?
So that was inspired by Benares. I'm going to read something from
Yes.
maybe, which one? Three Sides of a Coin?
Yeah, that's my favorite too. Mhm.
Okay. You appear like a confession from my soul, the fragrance of a tropical breeze soon after the first monsoon shower, calming yet expectant. Your promises resonate like church bells in an abandoned monastery, hollow in its heaviness, yet barren. Your words evoke a forgotten melody, like an innocent lullaby, crippled without a tune and the memory of sleep, conjuring up nothingness out of nothingness, the paradoxical completion of an untold story.
How lovely is that?
So
And then you
that's
get off to Cape Town, Africa, right? So
exactly. So that's how the story moves from Cape Town, Africa to Istanbul, Turkey,
Mhm.
and then we end in Prague, Czech
the,
Republic. So
the
that's
third
how.
side of the coin. Okay.
Yes. So
Brilliant.
that's
And,
another
and I
story.
love that word. There is something so perfectly unsynchronized about this moment. Yeah. So moments, even in momentarilessness, there is something at times which is not synchronized. Yeah. Sorry,
True.
to get on to your third.
And I'll do this one. Which one? The beautiful one has come. That's my sister's
That's
favorite
okay.
description. Maybe I'll go there.
Yeah, sure.
Just the first paragraph. So this story, the beautiful one has come, is inspired by one of Egypt's most beautiful queens.
Mhm.
And I'm not going to tell you who it is, but when you read it, you will know. And when I was in Egypt, again, I let myself loose into the chapters of history, and I had to take myself into a time machine to kind of be there in this space. So that's what inspired the story. I'm going to just read the first paragraph, maybe.
And before you do that, sorry, I'm interrupting. Can you read the Wheel of Time just before that? That the poem which you written, those 3 lines. That was
Okay,
quite
I will.
extraordinary.
I will. I will. I am a daughter of the earth. I am the mother of fire. I carry the ocean in my womb and the air on my feet. I carry the universe in the lines of my destiny.
How lovely is that? Yeah.
I have very recently used that for that Janani Vashundhara.
Yeah, that's why I wanted to read it. Yeah.
Okay, I will read a little bit from this. The beautiful one has come. Uh, there's another secret to this, and I'll probably just reveal it. So, this beautiful queen, her name actually means the beautiful one has come. So
Mhm.
that's the meaning of her name, and that's the cartouche, the Egyptian lockets, I would say, the ones that they would wear with the um,
Draping.
symbols, and so that's how her name is actually interpreted in Egyptian, in the local language. Blue, the color of blood, ocean deep, the ink for my poetry, the coal in her Egyptian eyes, the sunshine across a desert, the secret of a glacier. The phantom of the night crept steadily through colossal monuments that stood like royal custodians of the desert valley. Hemmed in by cliffs, the desert rose to a plateau. The sand marked the peripheries of the city of Akhetaten, which was waiting for the winds to shift. The turquoise Nile, youthful and flamboyant during the day, now held a constellation of stars in its coldly netted embrace. It flowed noiselessly and glistened like a sequined stole in midnight blue. Not a hint of moonlight crept through, and if the insidious darkness spoke, it was only through the unpropitious hooting of an owl. So that's the setting. And then, of course, the queen wakes up and realizes that the pharaoh is dying, and then the story starts.
I love the narrative also. It was quite gripping. That's where you had to finish it in one go. Thank you for that. So that was a lovely way to end this evening with your book. But before we further end the evening, I want you to read out a few lines in Bengali from the first poem you had written when you had published this book, right?
The first book. So the night I published my first book, Arti Satya, I came back to spend my night with my besties. Two of my best friends had flown in, one from Bangalore and the other from New York, just to be there for my book launch. And we were spending this night together. And before we could, get on with our girls' party, I decided to, write something that was playing on my mind. And this was it. And so please forgive me. I have never studied Bangla in school, so I wasn't formally educated in Bangla. Yet I dare to write sometimes, dushsahosh, as we say. So please forgive me for this. আজ আমি সাঁঝবেলার শঙ্খধ্বনি, আজ আমি এক ফালি একাদশীর চাঁদ, আজ আমি ক্লান্তি মাখানো পথে হঠাৎ পাওয়া এক্কা দোক্কার ছক, আজ আমি ঘন নীল বালুচরীর নকশা, আজ আমি যত্নে সাজানো এলো খোঁপার ফুল, আজ আমি উঠোন ভেজানো সোদামাটির গন্ধ, আজ আমি শীতের রাতের লেপের আদর, আজ আমি বিপ্লব, আজ আমি কণ্ঠস্বর, আজ আমি আমার সবচেয়ে প্রিয় আমি, আজ আমি অনন্যা, আজ আমি অপরাজিতা.
How lovely is that? And I'm going to attempt to read this in English, right? I am the evening melody of the temple conch shell, the slice of the crescent moon, the hop-skip patterns you suddenly stumble upon on lonesome, tiring roadways, the intricate motif of a blue baloichori shari, the flower that adorns your loosely tied bun, the sweet fragrance of the moist earth as rain sweep across your courtyard, the caress of a warm blanket on cold winter nights. I am revolution. I am speech. I am my favorite me. I am Ononno. I am invincible. How lovely was that? Yeah. Thank you for this. And I'm going to further do one small poem of yours, which I think is extraordinary because this sums it all up. And I'm not going to ask you, what you want to be remembered for, because that is too cliched. I think this poem of yours does wonders. So do you mind if I just read this to end this lovely evening? Yeah.
Please go ahead.
One day, when the war is over, I will forget the face of my enemy. The wound will stop bleeding and only a scar will remain. One day, when my tears dry up, I will begin to see the world again. The spears ripping my heart will pause, and only stories of my courage shall prevail. On that epitaph mine, on what shall remain of me, I hope you will find a monastery of empathy, valor, honor, love, and pride. And how lovely is that? With these few words, I would like to thank you, Ananya, for spending more than an hour with us on a busy weekend and a busy year end, and sharing a bit of your extraordinary life for us to get a glimpse of how to live our lives in the fullness it deserves, in the freedom of existence, and doing all the things you deeply love and are passionate about without compromise and with the excellence it deserves. So thank you again. And thank you everyone for being with us this evening. So I'm going to wind up the evening saying thank you again, Ananya, for being with us, and all the very best. And I hope that your new book will be up and running very soon, including a cookbook, which you didn't mention, which I'm sure might come up with also.
Thank you so much for having me here. It was a pleasure talking to you. And yeah, there's nothing extraordinary about my life. I just think I do ordinary things quite well. That's all there is to it. Thank you, everybody, for watching and staying up. I know for those in my time zone, it's quite late in the night for a Sunday evening, but thank you so much. And for those watching from India, Merry Christmas, and wish you all a very, very happy New Year.
Wish everyone a happy New Year and season greetings to everyone. Bye-bye, everyone. Bye-bye, Ananya. Yeah. Ta-da. Good night.
Bye.
Good night. I'll have this up on YouTube very soon for the others if you want to share this round.